Hello to everybody. Yes, I'm from IOPS and also OECD, and I was browsing the participants list, and it looks to me like a very familiar society. At least half of them are from IOPS members, so it's good to see them. So we will start with the first presentation. Will be a bit different order than we assumed. We will start with the first presentation that will be gender gap in the Chilean pension system, and it will be presented by Ximena. There are three authors. The first author is Fernanda Toledo, Ximena Quintanilla, and Paulina Granados. Three of them, all of them work for the Superintendence of Pensions regulator in Chile. And I think not to waste the time, let's give the floor to Ximena. Thank you.
Thank you, Dariusz. Thank you, everyone, for organizing this seminar. It's very motivating. So this paper is about the gender gaps in the Chilean pension system. And we focus mainly on two variables, on two outcomes: their contributions probability in the pension system and pension savings. This is a co-work with two other authors, Paulina Granados and Fernanda Toledo, that is here in the room with us. So just to give you a bit of motivation, we know there is broad consensus about the existence of gender gaps in the labor market. Now, these gaps are, of course, transferred to the pension system, regardless of its design, whether it's a DB, DC, or national or other type of arrangement. In the case of the Chilean pension system, which is fully funded with defined contributions, the gender gaps in the labor market impact directly the self-finance pensions through mainly the earnings gap, but also, and very importantly, through the work or out of work patterns, which affect contribution patterns, participation in the pension system patterns. So we're going to define a variable called contribution density, which is basically the number of months that a person has contributed to the pension system over the months as a member to the pension system, right? So this is a variable, of course, that goes from 0 to 1. So, and the gaps, the gender gaps in contribution density result in gaps in the accumulated pension savings and eventually in the self-funded pension benefit. We're going to focus on this type of gaps. In this analysis, we're going to leave out other determinants, such as pension funds returns, life expectancy for men and for women, first pillar benefits, and other designs, other elements of the design, for example, as legal retirement age. So just to move on with the motivation, the gender gaps in our labor markets are there, of course. We have about 11% gender gaps on earnings. We have a contribution density gap of about nearly 9% percentage points against the woman. So they contribute for about 9% percentage points less than men. That's while working. At retirement, newly retirees, the people who retired in the last 12 months, women had 7 less years contributed to the pension system than men. They had a contribution density of more than of less than 10% percentage points lower than men, and their pension savings as a result of mainly these two things were lower in nearly 56%. So of course, women are going to have lower pension benefits through these channels. Okay, so what we're going to do in this paper is we are willing to assess the impact of the determinants of the observed gaps And as I said before, we're going to focus on two dependent variables, the probability of contribution to the pension system and the evolution of the accumulated pension savings. And then we are going to analyze the gap on pension savings for different cohorts over time. So we are going, the first outcome variable, the probability of contributing to the pension system, we're going to estimate through a logistic model, and the difference in the accumulated balance or savings is going to be estimated through OLS. We're going to use data, administrative data from the pension system. We have data from 2007 to 2019. For everyone in the pension system, month by month, both whether they have contributed or not, their monthly earnings, and of course their pension savings. And as the determinants we're going to use are going to be demographic variables such as sex and age, and labor market variables such as earnings when people became members of the pension system, and the density of contributions. So here are some descriptives of our data. Here we have the gaps in accumulated pension balance, the savings, pension savings. So the dark blue bars show the gap against women by age brackets. See, so we can see that there is a gender gap across all ages, and this gap increases with age. We also see in these middle bars here, the light blue bars, here we have the contribution density brackets, right, from 0 to 10%, from 10% to 20%, and so on and so forth. This from 90% to 100% are people who contribute most of their working lives. So we can see that the pension balance gap, there is a big gap for people with the lowest contribution density, and then it's slightly increasing with contribution density. And finally, we have contribution density with quantiles of earnings, and we see that the gap is decreasing in quantiles. Here we have another variable. We have the gaps in contribution density. You all are already having a sense how important this variable it is for accumulation, for asset accumulation. So again, we have the gap in contribution density by age brackets. The gap is increasing in age. But notably, the gap is it's flatter in quantiles, as you can see, and in the fifth quantile, the gap is practically diminished. Now, moving on to the results, we have, this is the first outcome variable. This is the probability of contributing in the pension system in 2019. You can see that we have more than 10 million more than 10 million members in our pension system. If we don't control by anything, we have a lower probability for women than men of about 11% of contributing in the pension system. Now, once we control for other factors such as age, number of months contributed, and the income in the last 3 years, this gap basically goes to 0, or it's very, very low. And it is similar between men and women. Now, moving on to the second outcome, which is accumulated pension savings in December 2019. We have, if we don't control for any determinants, we see a gap of against women of about 51%. So women accumulate by December 2019, 15% less pension savings than men. Once we control for these different factors that are obvious factors to control for, that gap lowers to 9%. So the important message here is that when we control for demographics and labor market variables, the gaps are much lower than we observe just in the descriptives. Now we move on to a cohort analysis. So here we have lines that show the evolution through age. Here we have age. In the y-axis, we have the gaps in pension savings for these different ages and for different cohorts. So for example, this green line here is for the cohort born in 1980, from 1980 to 1984, right? We have 5-year cohorts. So we see the gap here for the cohort born in 1980, and so their gaps when they were about 27 years old, when we first observed them, they have a gap of a bit higher than 30%, and that higher reduces a bit as this cohort ages to 28%. Right, and so we have the graph for different cohorts. So the first feature to notice here is the gender gap has been narrowing across cohorts. The lines of younger cohorts are above their preceding ones, in particular for the cohorts born after 1966, which is the orange line here. So that's what I'm trying to show you with this red arrow going from right to left, that the gap has been decreasing across cohorts, right? Now, another feature that we see from this graph, two other facts that we see from this graph, is that the youngest cohorts analyzed the cohort born in 1990 starts with a very high gap, but then it catches up with their preceding cohorts. When they were 26, they cross the gap of the cohort born in 1985, and they're nowadays they're having a gap of about 23%. But they started with a very high gender gap in pension savings. Now, the other interesting fact is that for the oldest cohort we observed, the ones born in 1955, they have a significantly lower gap than their preceding cohorts, the ones born in 1960. This is probably due to a selection of women here working, this older woman working in the labor market. Now, we can also see in the same graph that the pension balance gap is flat in age for the cohorts born between 1960 and 1975. As you can see, their gap doesn't change much as they age, right? On the other hand, for the younger cohorts, this one that we noticed before that started really high, but also this one, the cohort born in 1985, and to a lesser extent, the cohort born in 1980, their gaps are decreasing with age. Okay, so now we're going to decompose that effect in following the Deaton methodology. We're going to decompose these effects in the gap age, cohort effect, and time effects. We're going to estimate this equation for men and women separately, and then we're going to calculate the gap, as the difference of the estimators for the explanatory variables. So that's what I'm going to show you next. So first of all, here we have the cohort effect. As we saw before, here we have cohorts. Here on the left hand side we have the logarithm of pension savings, and on the right hand side we have the gender gap. As we saw already in the graph before, the gap is narrowing. It's very low for younger cohorts. It's very close to zero for the cohort born in 1985 to 89, and it was a bit higher, but it's about 6 to 7% for the younger cohort. These results can be due to improved education and labor conditions for women or programs incentivizing participation of women in the labor market. So these are good news for younger generations. Now, the time effects, we also have good news here. As you can see, the gap has been reducing, and it's nearly zero in the later periods. It started at nearly about 27%, but it's nearly zero in the last few years. But the age effect is still there, right? We see that the age effects starts with a high gap of about 45% at younger ages, then it decreases with age, reaching a minimum when people are about in their early 40s, and then it increases again as they age up to, this is 65 years old is the legal retirement age for women, and 65 is the retirement age for men. So we can see that from a lowest point in when they're in their early 40s, the gap increases again to the legal retirement age. We certainly need to have a deeper look at this finding. Probably what we're going to do next in this research is to introduce more socioeconomic variables such as education that we didn't have before. We're just getting that data these days, and also on family composition variables to try to understand a bit better this age effect. So now to conclude, the pension system reflects labor market inequalities. If labor markets variables are considered, such as labor earnings and time contributing, and as I said before, the time contributing in the system reflects the work or out of work, or at least out of formal work patterns, then the gender gaps in pension balance and contribution density decrease, disappearing for even the gap for contribution density. Gaps in pension balances or pension savings have been decreasing through generations and through time. This can be the result of improvements in the labor market conditions through time and generations. Gaps in pension savings are decreasing in age for younger cohorts. However, these gaps start at a high level at the beginning of their working life. And further, as I mentioned, the age effect seems to be persistent. More research is needed to understand its determinants. And finally, I want to say that it's imperative that we keep learning and researching on gender gaps in the pension system. If we continue with this type of analysis, then we can hopefully implement successful measures to close these gaps, diminishing the gender inequalities in the pension system. So thank you. That's what I had to share with you today.
Thank you very much, Ximena. So I will invite Ricky Kanabar from the University of Bath and also Netspar to make a presentation on relabelling of individual early retirement pension in Finland.
Well, I suppose good morning from the UK, or good afternoon, good night, good evening, Lord knows what to say. But anyway, hello to you all. It's good to see many familiar faces and names. So I'm going to talk to you today about a reform which we analysed based on Finnish registry data. I don't need to tell anybody on this call really about the importance of understanding labour supply behaviour at older ages, and indeed in the context of early retirement, but also the more general issue of ageing populations and implications for social security and public finances at large. So this is joint work with Satu Nivalainen and Nora Janfeldt at the Finnish Centre for Pensions. And we are going to exploit a natural experiment which took place almost 20 years ago now, to look at what we call relabelling. And I will come on to relabelling very shortly. So I don't want to spend too long today about the motivation and background, partly because of the audience, but also because of the time allocation. But what I do want you to think about is the period just before individuals reach state pension age, first pillar pension age, okay? So if we think about a lot of the reforms which have taken place across OECD countries, they typically, or quite often, will target first pillar state pension eligibility age. For example, in the UK, it's somewhere 66-ish now. However, whilst those reforms have been largely effective, it depends a little bit on who's still in the labour market or who's sort of active at the time. So I want you to think about the period just before that, okay? And there's much less literature on understanding the importance of early retirement pathways. And I mention that because, as I say, a lot of the reforms we think about are at first pillar, targeted at first pillar, okay? So in Finland, so if we think about the Finnish context now, again, similar to some OECD countries, there was a multitude of early retirement pathways, okay, in the early 2000s. The effective retirement age in Finland in the late 90s, early 2000s was 59, and the first pillar eligibility age was 65. So that's 6 years. So there was a massive policy issue around 25 years ago or so, where policymakers were trying to push up effective retirement ages, okay? They were very conscious and very aware of this. So indeed, we basically exploit this consolidation of pathways, and in particular, two pathways which were typically used by individuals who were poorly to some extent, who had health-related conditions, okay? So I'm going to explain that in more detail. If I don't cover everything, well, I will try my very best. Just to note, in terms of the sort of key takeaways, we do find a strong role for labeling or relabeling in this case on individual application behavior. And that's our kind of key dimension or margin of interest is whether individuals choose to apply or not following the reform we analyze. And importantly, there is behavioral responses which differ across groups. So if we think about equity reasons, we do find that, for example, individuals who are less educated are disproportionately more affected by the reform. And again, if we all know about life cycle accumulation of pension wealth and certain groups accumulating less. So there is some equity issues here. Fine. Okay, so let's turn to the Finnish context. In the early 2000s, there was a couple of main retirement pathways. The first one was called IER, Individual Early Retirement Pension. Okay, it was open to all individuals who were 58 to 64 in the pre-reform period. Okay, I'm going to show you some descriptive statistics of actual applicants' behavior, which is provided by the pension fund. Okay, and you will see, and I can tell you that the literature shows that people who applied for individual early retirement had mild to moderate health conditions, okay? Importantly, there's two things to note. There's no clear-cut eligibility criteria for IER, except to say individuals had to have a relatively strong work history, and their reduction in work capacity, which had to be shown as permanent, and it had to be, you need to have medical evidence when you apply for this pathway, was assessed against individuals' current occupation. So, for example, a builder who could no longer function as a builder would possibly, would have a good chance of, assuming they had the relevant medical criteria and evidence, would be able to claim for this pathway. Okay. The alternative pathway was ODP, Ordinary Disability Pension. This was a general pathway open to all individuals, 16 to 64, but of course including 58 to 64. And again, I'm going to show you in a moment, the people who applied for ODP had relatively severe health conditions. For full ODP, you had to have a 60%, proven 60% reduction in work capacity. And importantly, against any occupation. So that same builder wouldn't possibly be eligible because the advisor would say, well, no, you can go and work, assuming you have the relevant skills, you could have worked in an alternative occupation. You could sit behind a desk, You could become an academic. Who knows? The point is, they may not be eligible. Okay. So I'm going to now, but the key point, sorry to note, is from a general perception point of view, ODP had relatively strong eligibility criteria. Okay, you had to have a proven 60% reduction, and because of this condition, the fact that it's assessing against any occupation, it was relatively, quite stringent. Please keep in mind there was alternative pathways. I will come on to that towards the end of the talk, but please keep in mind just IER and ODP for now. Okay, so like I said, there was a observation, at least a difference in terms of the types of individuals who applied for IER versus ODP. This middle column is IER applicants. Okay, so this is application data from the year 2000, and this is the information in the year before, that's 99. You can see that annual labour income in euros is higher amongst IER applicants versus ODP. Okay, so 25,000 versus 17,500. You'll also see they had a slightly higher proportion of potential working life spent in employment, and importantly, they were much more likely to have a tertiary level of education versus ODP applicants, and also much more likely to occupy higher socioeconomic class jobs. Okay, so the reason I'm showing you this is to give you a flavor of the types of people who are applying. And so essentially what you should take away is these individuals who apply for IER are relatively more advantaged in the traditional ways we think about it. Okay, the nice thing about the data we have is that we also have information from the pension fund. Okay, pension fund also gives us information about who is rejected and who and why. And you will see that the first thing to note, a much lower proportion of applicants get rejected because they don't have an insufficient working career in the IER case. Whereas, for example, a much lower proportion of individuals who apply for ODP get rejected on the grounds of having insufficient work capacity being reduced. Okay, so they do meet that criteria. But what's important is amongst those who are successful in applying, you will see that a much higher proportion of ODP applicants, ordinary disability pension, have tumours. Think of cancers, for example, versus IER. IER applicants have a much higher proportion of reporting musculoskeletal diseases versus ordinary disability pension. In the same way, cardiovascular diseases are much higher amongst those who apply for ODP. So again, I'm just showing you this to give you a flavour of the types of people who apply, okay, pre-reform. So what happened? Okay, so like I said to you, Finnish policymakers wanted to consolidate these pathways, okay? So what they did, they said, okay, so in 2000 they announced they're going to increase the eligibility age for IER from 58 to 60, but they kept coverage the same. So from 60 onwards, the key thing to note, following the reform, the eligibility conditions were identical. So, as I said, so there was a subsequent reform in 2003, an announcement that just scrapped IER completely. Okay, so what happened was IER, so let's think of it as the more lenient pathway, was consolidated with ODP, which traditionally, for many, many years, decades, had this sort of stringent label attached to it. But importantly, as soon as individuals hit age 60, the new minimum eligibility age, they could apply for what we call flexible ODP, the new consolidated pathway, under exactly the same eligibility conditions as they could pre-reform. So essentially, that's what we're doing. We're exploiting relabelling because from 2004 onwards, people who are 60 onwards could claim flexible ODP under identical conditions as IER because they had that was the law. And we want to understand, okay, well, does this simple relabelling, which I don't think policymakers intended to do to have this effect, led to a decline in applications? And indeed, we also look at successful awards because we're interested in fiscal perspective too. And not to spoil the story, but we see a huge reduction, relatively speaking. So this just shows you this descriptively. In the first column, we've got cohorts by single year. And if you look across, we've got ages 60, 61, 62. These are the eligibility ages, okay? So we know after 1940, for all individuals born in 1944, what do we see? Well, about 38% decline, about 1.8 percentage point decline in application. So inadvertently, I'm kind of spoiling the results here. I'm going to show you this kind of econometrically. We see a significant reduction, okay, in applications, even though all of these cohorts could apply post-reform. All of these cohorts could apply for flexible ODP under the same conditions as IER, and they didn't. Okay, and I'll tell you what they did instead in a moment. So let's skip over the data. We're pushed for time. Very, very rich data. Finnish registry data of the whole population. I impose relevant sample conditions, eligibility conditions, criteria, everything that we need. We have about 378,000 observations. In terms of, and again, I'm going to be brief on this. We can come back to it in the questions if you want to. We follow something in the spirit of what we call a regression discontinuity, for those who are familiar with that approach. Because we have registered data, we know people's date of birth, and we can basically work out differences in application behavior just before and after the reform, okay? And we can control for lots of things which economists and econometricians, applied economists are concerned about, okay? Key thing to note, we identify a combination of two things, because recall, the minimum eligibility age increased to 60, and then we know that post-reform people could apply at 60 to 62. So we identify an effect, which is a combination of those two things together. We can't separate those things out, that's not possible, but we essentially identify the reform effect as a combination of those two things. Just to note, and our approach isn't the typical regression discontinuity, because normally you would look at people just before and after the cutoff. The cutoff is January 1944, because that's the first cohort, which essentially is going to be affected by the reform. We do lots and lots of robustness checks, which look at people just born December 1943 versus January 1944, which is much more typical to the standard regression discontinuity. Everything still goes through. But the reason why we look at people who are born slightly before the cutoff is because there was some leniency criteria, which was imposed by the government. Basically, people who are treated in people who were born in 1942 and 43 were given some extra leniency criteria because of the nature of the reforms. And you will see that in the application behavior. But just so you know, we do lots and lots of robustness checks in the paper. We can talk about that later on, and everything still goes through. So for all intents and purposes, think of it as something similar to a regression discontinuity. Our reform effective interest is beta 4. This is just a very standard regression discontinuity setup. Okay, I'm not going to spend too long on this, given the audience and the time. So what do we see? So this is a typical sort of graph that we see in regression discontinuity designs. This 0 here is January 1944, and we see a very large drop in applications amongst those people who are actually eligible based on their criteria, even though they were indeed possibly, they were eligible, but because of this relabeling, we see a significant reduction. We call these cohorts who were born 1942-43 transition cohorts. Like I said, they were treated with some leniency. So what happened was they were allowed to apply for either IER or ODP on the application when they applied. And due to the nature of timing of the reform, we see that basically these individuals are basically responding to some extent to this relabeling. Because if you're 62 and born in 1942, that's 2004. If you're 61 or 62, born in 1943, that's 2004, 2005. So these guys, this group here, born in 1942, 1943, were actually eligible to apply, but they reduced the application behavior, right? That's why this green line is downward sloping. If I drew this green line just through these two cohorts, 1940, 1941, it will be a flat horizontal line. And then you would see the traditional kind of RDD sort of graph. So that's why we control for these guys formally in the econometric estimation. So I don't want to spend too long on this now, just to show you the point to take away from this graph is that there's a sharp reduction at the eligibility age here, okay? And indeed, when I spoke to you earlier about and I showed you that table, that reduction from 1944 onwards, you will see here the post-reform, the main effect, 1.8 percentage points. It's about 38% decline in applications, which is huge. It's massive, okay? I don't think policymakers intended to do this possibly. I'm speaking to the Finnish Centre for Pensions, but we're not, they're the ministry responsible for a lot of these reforms in part. And, they were also shocked at the size of this effect, okay? So that's the key finding. The other thing to note is say, well, actually, from a policy perspective, were certain groups more likely to respond than not? Okay, and yes, the answer is yes. So because we have such a large sample, we can basically repeat that same estimation exercise I just showed you for different subgroups, and these are the subgroups on here. And we see that basically the decline is driven by people with lower levels of education. For the people who have tertiary level education, we don't see much going on. Okay. We know there's lots of literature out there which talks about financial planning and retirement planning. We know that people are more highly educated and more informed about pensions, retirement, financial advice, taking financial advice, etc. So from an equity perspective and a policy perspective, this is concerning because if people are less likely to apply, well, who is that? Well, it's typically those people who are low educated. So you should ask yourself, well, actually, what are they doing then instead? Okay, we're going to be concerned about these people because they have lower lifetime pension wealth, etc. Okay, and indeed, people who have higher labour force attachment were also more likely to respond. And if you recall, it's the same people, this group of the people who are more likely to apply for IEI in the pre-reform period. Okay. Right, I don't want to talk about robustness checks due to time. We do more than our fair share, and nothing changes. We do lots of non-parametric stuff. We look at looking in the neighbourhood just before and after the cutoff. Everything's basically stayed the same. The narrative doesn't change. Just to say, I told you earlier there were alternative retirement pathways. So what did people do? What they did was they switched something called PTP. PTP is part-time. It's partial retirement. It's part-time pathway. Okay, it's an arrangement where an individual goes to their employer. They sit down and they make an agreement where there's an agreed reduction in working hours, but an individual continues working in the labour market, but at part-time. So essentially, what happened from this reform is that people switched into an alternative competing pathway, but the competing pathway at least didn't lead to people dropping out of the labour force. They continued working part-time, so they made some labour, they contributed to, in terms of work, in terms of taxes, and they remained at least partially engaged in the labour market. And the substitution effects are, well, the switching rates are almost in line with what we estimate in terms of reduction in applications, okay? And indeed, if we investigate the characteristics of those people who switched to part-time pension, they were the same sorts of people who are more likely to apply for IEL, okay? So what we're seeing is people reducing applications, but also switching to an alternative pathway. We do lots of other, we check other pathways, we don't see much going on. There were other reforms going on a bit after the reform we consider, but there's nothing going on there. Final thing to note, from a fiscal perspective, you might ask, well, okay, applications are all good and well. We understand that's the dimension that policymakers can affect. But what about successful applications? Okay, from a fiscal perspective, is central government paying out more money? And the answer is, well, actually, we also see a significant reduction in successful awards as well. Okay, so not only was there a reduction in applications, but also almost a 1.5 percentage point reduction in successful applications. So I'm going to wrap up there. The summary is sharp fall in applications, sharp fall in successful awards, switching into an alternative pathway, but which still at least kept people in the labour market, albeit at a part-time rate. And then the key thing to note in terms of policy applications, if you are a policymaker who's interested in consolidating early retirement pathways, precisely due to the fiscal pressures of population ageing, you simply must be aware of the roles of spillovers into the pathways, but also disproportionately affecting certain groups, for example, those who are more likely to have lower lifetime pension wealth, and also just being more mindful of the fact that labelling, which is relatively quite rare, but if you do basically consolidate pathways which will historically have certain social norms or awareness attached to them, could potentially have very, very strong behavioural consequences, which you may a priori not have intended to have made. Okay, I'm gonna stop there in the interest of time, but thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Ricky.